Good evening. The news gang is here tonight. Quarantine quarrels, the stonewalling, the wall of silence, and why some are jumping over the walls. Also on the show, the coastal port of entry. Who let the virus out? We'll also revisit the big city hall where Sonko lives. Did he indeed sign the deed without knowing what he did? Well, the deed is done. What next? On the punchline, Gashuri is flattening the curve you've never thought about. Jamila asks what your life is really worth. Yvonne won't mind a little empathy. The kicker pays tribute to a fallen giant, and the angle is perpendicular to the national exams. Let's start the show. Ladies and gentlemen, too many quarrels about quarantine. Jamila, what is really going on?
Me kwanza, the shock on me was when I saw the two gentlemen jumping over the fence at one of the quarantine centers, and immediately what came to mind was what if they were among those who had the virus? And then we hear there are some.
Well, as it is now, we don't know.
We don't know.
Yeah.
And then the next thing we hear, one of them has been found in Litein in the county of Kericho.
Your county, actually.
My home county, and it makes me wonder. Si kulikuwa na amri ya kutotoka Nairobi. Like, we were not supposed to be leaving Nairobi. Hakuna mtu anatoka, hakuna mtu anaingia. So these guys made their way to Litein in Kericho. And then that, of course, brings a whole set of questions about how waliruka wall wakapita
and they jumped over the road and got wherever that
exactly. And of course, it raises a lot of questions about how bad are those conditions in those quarantine centers that people are having to resort to running away. Remember, in some of these centers, after 14 days, 14 more days were added of quarantine, and then another 14 days, because in some of them, people who were supposed to be under quarantine tested positive, and in fact, Dr. Amoth said in some of these places, what walitangamana, people did not practice social distancing. But question comes in, like, how those facilities are, there really isn't any opportunity for social distancing. We saw some pictures around on social media of one of those quarantine centers. I think it's one of the high schools around, a normal dome, and people are sleeping right next to each other, the way domes usually are. So there's no social distancing being practiced there. Begs the question of someone who's not infected, who doesn't have a virus, sleeping in such conditions next to someone who could be having it, maybe is asymptomatic. What does that mean? Umeenda quarantine center, we mwenyewe kupatiwa virusi. I know it's important for us to be able to contain the virus, and that's one of the measures the government is putting in place. But how exactly are those quarantine centers?
Yeah, a very good question, Linus. The state of quarantine centers, and we will discuss whether that's justification people to jump over the wall or whether someone allowed them and all of that. But there's a lot of controversy around quarantine centers. I mean, quarantine is a very scientific process. I mean, I was going to talk about cows, but I will not. But this is something that extends all the way to even how you manage livestock diseases and that sort of thing. And the idea is that if we suspect the disease is here, we want it to stay here so that we manage it here without it spreading to other places. And that's what this was supposed to be. But it seems that too many issues have come up, the state of the facilities themselves, but lately even the reasons why people get thrown into those facilities in the first place.
It is an unfortunate scenario, Joe, that the country finds itself in, and not just the country, but the world. I think what needs to happen is a realization, especially with the population, that these are not ordinary times. The facilities in our secondary schools will not change and be upgraded into hotel status just because we have a quarantine. They remain dormitories, double-deckers probably, because that is where the situation is taking us to. I think what we are facing currently is a situation where there is lack of a clear appreciation of the situation we are facing in. Is it a communication problem? I doubt that. I think it is a behavioral question. I think the government could do better in terms of making sure these facilities are at least functioning in the way a quarantine center should function. We still see beds that are too close to each other. We still see people who are saying, they're telling us that they're interacting in a way that doesn't respect the social distancing aspects. But in terms of quarantines, let's all remember it can actually get worse than this because these are extraordinary times. COVID has been described as a war, an invisible war. Now, if we talk about the real war, What does the real world do? It forces people into camps, tents, trenches, very, very uncomfortable places. I think there's this need to either communicate or to create an appreciation of the wider picture. This is not the worst it can be. It can be worse than this.
And it's an interesting thing, actually, when you move around. I mean, because some of us who live in the outer edges of the Nairobi metropolitan area, and you go to some of those places and people will tell you, hapa hakuna corona. There's just this thing that it belongs to the other people. It's not me. It is not here. It's somewhere out there. And there's almost like a mystery around this thing, that it is not something that would affect someone you know, Yvonne.
Yeah, that's right. You know, it just seems like the other, it's the others, it's them over there. But I think for me, what that daring escape or prison break, if you like, points to two things. One is communication, and two is the law. Yes, we may be fighting a war, but you know, the Constitution and the law has not been suspended. We are not in a state of emergency by any means. Let's take a look at the law, for example, because what has happened is that quarantine has been made a punishment. It's been made a threat. It's been made a sentence. And so in doing so, you attach a stigma to it, to the extent that very few people who exhibit any of the symptoms will want to say, hey, you know, I think I may have come into contact with somebody who may have been infected. And the stigma is exactly what you don't want at a time like this, particularly when you're dealing with, you know, what we're talking about, silent spreaders and asymptomatics. Now, be that as it may, there's a couple of things that happen within the quarantine. One is communication. And I think Dr. Githinji Gitahi alluded to this yesterday when he was being interviewed by Jeff Koinange on JKL Live, which is, are people being told you are here, this is why you're here, this is how long you will be here, the reason we're keeping you here for 14 days is because this is the incubation period, we will not test you in the first day or the second day, we'll probably do the testing on the 8th day. You know, the dignity of patients and persons in this manner. You saw the two individuals yesterday, they said, Mimi, I've been here for 2 days, hakuna mtu ameniambia kitu, I have not been tested. You know, when you live in a vacuum, no one is telling you anything, you get anxious and you're in this closed space and you wonder, well, wait, why am I here? But then when it comes to the law, and this is what we're talking about, quarantine being treated as punishment. So number one, it is still a mystery to me why people, even the Kenyans who came into the country from abroad, remember before we closed our airspaces, are being made to pay for quarantine, because that's another issue. I mean, the two gentlemen yesterday going to be charged 2,000 shillings a day for 14 days. That's 28,000 bob. That's difficult. And this is it. If you take a look at the Public Health Act, Section 27 says isolation of persons who've been exposed to infection, who may be in the incubation stage, against the spread, such person may, on a certificate signed by the medical officer of health, be removed by order of a magistrate. Do we know if that happened in any of these cases? And at the cost of the local authority of the district where such person is found. That says that in the law. But here we are, people are being forced to pay for quarantine at their own cost. What happened to NHIF? What happened to the taxes that we pay? So these are some of the things that you see that, you know, put a stigma around quarantine and that people would want to escape. The other thing about making quarantine a punishment, why do we do that? I mean, if you take a look at even the laws in terms of that, the Public Order Act, which, by the way, they are citing, says that any person who contravenes any provisions of a curfew on any of the terms of conditions shall be guilty and be given a 10,000 shillings fine, a 3-month jail term, or both. So if you violate the curfew, you are supposed to be taken to court, which, by the way, you know, is... Well, to be fair, haven't they been saying, Yvonne, that the assumption they are making that when you are found outside the hours is that you may have been exposed. You may have been in a place, because they're saying that right now... The people who are... I'm just telling you what they have been saying. There is no scientific evidence for that argument, that if you've been out of the house at 7:01, that you are exposed, and you are not exposed at 6:59. What? The virus moves around between 7 p.m. and 5 a.m. I mean, all of these decisions must be based on scientific evidence. Violating a curfew is one thing. You cannot say that because you are out of the house after 7, that then you are deemed to have been exposed. For heaven's sake, we're not under a lockdown. Maybe you are locked up in a bar
are like
no, that's fine. But right now we're not under lockdown, right? So we're doing business.
If you breach the boundaries that they have put, then if, for example, like you're coming from Kajiado, you get into Nairobi or whatever, that Nairobi has been declared an infected area.
Fine. What is the law? Then you declare me guilty, 10,000 or the jail term, or you don't do the jail term, fine me. What I mean is...
But that assumes that you know their status. I think the argument they're making is that because you're in an infected area, chances are that you're infected, and we don't know. So
we don't know that, but it's the same argument if I am out at 5 o'clock, in the evening. I mean, what I just think for me is that once we start to sort of shift the goalposts when it comes to the law, what else are we going to do? You move an inch, then you move a mile. And I think it's still important, that we follow the law, which is what they're citing in all of these cases.
And this is the challenge that we face currently. Number one, quarantine was meant for the greater good.
Yeah.
The greater good being that you have probably been in contact with somebody who is infected. So we are taking you away from the general public that is not infected so that you don't spread the infection. Mm-hmm. So is there a separate quarantine center for those who were picked up as a result of contact tracing and those who are being punished for violating and flouting curfew rules? There isn't. All of them are being taken to KMTC. So those who probably even willingly said so-and-so was taken ill, has been found positive for COVID-19. So let me jitolea and go for quarantine. You're being lumped together with violators, guys who are drinking, people who are not careful. That brings that stigma that Yvonne is talking about. So there is need first to separate issues. Mm-hmm. If it is about punishing those who are violating the curfew rules and actually they deserve punishment, then punish them separately based on the law, separate from those who have been picked up as a result of contact tracing, so that you don't escalate the infections, number one. Number two, we've seen photographs and videos from those quarantine facilities. People are sharing facilities, bathrooms, and even rooms. So what stops the infection therein? And thirdly, there's a question of cost. I saw some people at KU, they were forced to pay 97,000 shillings. There's another person, I saw an invoice of 54,000 shillings from KMTC. This is an issue.
What happens if you don't pay anyway?
Yeah,
that's the question.
What will they do?
Yeah.
Because
this is for quarantine.
I was speaking to someone.
Not even for treatment.
I was speaking to someone in government who said, like, let those people not tell you they're paying anything. A lot of them are refused to pay, and so it's.
But if they can't.
Yeah, because I don't know what the recourse is. Yeah.
I just wanted to the point raised by both Yvonne and Francis about quarantine. The problem with our context as Kenyans is we tend to challenge the law you guys are talking about.
Yep.
At all the times, we want to stretch it. Because if it's 7 p.m., you still want to have an excuse to be spared for being out at 7:30. And there's something that has happened. The first day, we all weighed in very heavily about the tactics taken by the police to
beat and release.
Beat and release. Funny enough, this in Kenya, beat and release worked more efficiently than any other steps after that. Because right now what we are seeing, because there is a relaxation of that, we are also seeing the relaxation of compliance. You're seeing people who are defying not just the curfew, but also the social distancing rules. Haven't we seen a lot of people being packed into police vehicles because they were in a party or drinking in a pub?
Or a wedding, like another one by cousins to Jamila.
Yes. We may cite the law, but these are not ordinary times. We are in a situation that even the courts themselves are not functioning properly. So I don't know which court that will be, because we can't convert all roadblocks to these very argumentative court sessions. When you look at other jurisdictions, Philippines, for example, the president, Duterte, ordered the military and the police to shoot people who defy the law, shoot dead, kill them, people who defy the quarantine procedures, the restrictions. Next door here in Uganda, I know there is no shoot to kill order, but don't test it. Yeah. Rwanda, there's a complete lockdown, and people respect it to the end.
India,
there's that as well. What is so difficult about us as Kenyans understanding that these are unusual times, and it actually requires that we operate slightly differently from normal. We can't have those arguments about, oh, read us the Constitution at a roadblock. You can't do that.
But you see the problem, Lina Aziz, when these stigma, these quarantine as a punishment, it beats the very purpose of that quarantine. No, let there be a separate way of dealing with those who are flouting the curfew regulations, number one, as opposed to those who have been traced via contact tracing and who are well aware of the reason for the quarantine. So otherwise, we are mixing both, and it is ending up with a negative result. So if negative result in the sense that if those people you're sharing a dormitory with were drinking somewhere, they were not careful. The only mistake that you probably made was maybe to come to this office, and maybe one of us was found positive. All of us who reported on duty today would be picked and placed on quarantine. So imagine a situation where we are being lumped together with some guys in Ruaka or some guys in Kilimani or some guys in Tasia who are caught drinking. So why will we be punished for the misbehavior of other people?
Yeah.
It's how they are treated, not the isolation, that you have an issue with, I think.
No,
Precisely.
yes, exactly.
Precisely.
And I think that
would it make a difference
the law is there to deal with...
Would it make a difference if you are taken and locked up at a police station?
Maybe.
Because I think for me is that the law exists to deal with the errant ones, because I think in every society there's always...
But today Mwangangi said that, this thing is not punishment, it's not detention.
Yeah, but after the threats of, if we find you, you will be deemed to be exposed. I think we've heard
this is my take, Joe. If government doesn't get tougher than this, then things will worsen. Because the violation of curfew, the violation of social distancing has become more present than before. We had our reporter joining people in a place.
Yeah, that's true.
Basically locking themselves up in a pub and drinking.
In fact,
how do you handle this? Because some of these things are not really about the Constitution. These are behavioral questions. If government doesn't get tougher than this, then things will get worse than they
remember, we are trying not to get to a situation that we are seeing other countries across the world are facing. And remember, WHO has said that this is going to get worse. We are not anywhere near the worst is over bit. And it said that many countries are actually in the early stages of the fight against the coronavirus. And when you hear countries on the early stages, and right now Kenya, we are at about 330 people, and we are not testing as much as we should. I think today we tested about 600 people plus. And then look at the situation we are seeing in Mombasa, where now it's starting to almost become the epicenter. But I think the reason we are seeing that is because, like, for instance, at KPA, there's mass testing going on, so we're getting more numbers from there. That's one. Two, what Linus talks about, tabia mbaya wa Kenya. We had instances in Mandera where people bribed their way out of a quarantine facility. We have the wedding that happened where 39 women were in a room and they were in a wedding. Now, what walishikwa, that was just one instance because people spoke out. We have in Ruai where I think 89 people now are almost under lockdown because of 4 that were found to be positive. You talked about an instance at a bar. I think it's a story we're going to run very soon, where people were really busy, like hakuna corona, the front door had been locked, they were passing through the back, and it's not just 1, 2 or 3 or 4 instances, there are very many where people are blatantly flouting the rules and regulations that have been put out there. We don't want to get to a situation like we are seeing other countries in the world who are able to handle it better than we are facing. We do not have enough ICU beds or ventilators or all those facilities that are required for people who have COVID-19 now end up in the ICU. Yes, we hear instances letters of medical practitioners telling us that we are experiencing mild to moderate COVID-19. It's not as bad as it is in those countries. We don't want to test it any further to see how bad can this get. So I think people just need to follow these regulations, social distancing, wear your masks, wash your hands, and just stay at home if you can. Enjoy baadaye.
Yeah. No doubt about it. Yeah. Actually, in any way should misbehavior and flouting of regulations and guidelines issued by the government be condoned. It is not acceptable. In any case, I thought the minister was doing very well explaining to people the need for personal responsibility. And you could see quite a number of people were taking it. But the moment it got to a different turn where you're told if you were caught without a face mask, you'll be taken to quarantine. It became more like, so it's a punishment. In fact, see, Isaac Mudhusi in a tweet here is saying, few coming weeks, quarantine centers will be full of people who broke the law by not wearing face masks and curfew, while coronavirus patients will have nowhere to be treated, as Kenya hasn't even reached the peak in this pandemic. And he makes a valid point, because if you arrest 100 people without face masks and you place them under quarantine today, and tomorrow you arrest another 200, 300.
Then what?
Then what? In any case, it should be more about explaining to people why they need to do it and drill that into their heads, show them the reasoning. If you make it punitive, some people will say...
I mean, and I think it's also about just underlying... addressing the underlying issues. So, when we talk about, for example, a face mask, which we know now is a directive, but we're still alive to the fact that there's many people in this country who are not going to make the choice between buying a face mask or buying a meal for the day. The government has not provided free face masks to all of them, where you say, okay, now listen, guys, we've given all of you free face masks and they're the reusable ones, so you have no excuse as to why you don't have one. And then for that, the punishment is what? You're taken into quarantine. I mean, it is also human nature that people buck and people resist when there is force, there's unexplained force, and they feel, oppressed.
So we need to take a break. John Mbadi, he says, let us continue reading laws until we find our bodies in verandas with no one to bury bodies. Some of these people behave like individuals carrying poison and spraying on others' food to eat. These are not ordinary times, and let us be careful in our communication to our people. Kenyans who can travel with empty coffins, lock themselves up in tiny rooms to drink and attend weddings behind closed doors. Kenyans can be arrogant and careless.
And he's absolutely right. He makes a lot of sense.
Shall we take that break?
I think it's the first time we're literally on opposite sides of that.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I mean, they over there and we over here.
we can switch you up after the break. Okay, let's take a break. News Gang will be back in a minute.